are a lot of people that talk about rights and are interested in rights, but they don't fully understand what they are bringing forth or what they are trying to explain. Many individuals, especially in Canada and the United States of America, will certainly say and express the fact that they have human rights. If pressed, they will say, yes, I have human rights. When asked to define what those rights mean to them, that is when it becomes clearly evident that the government has failed to educate us as individuals as it pertains to our fundamental rights and freedoms, our human rights. A natural right, a fundamental right. This is a right, or these are rights, that you are born with. The government did not give them to you. The government did not create them on paper and then allow you to exercise them. It is just fundamentally accepted and universally accepted that these rights exist and you are allowed to exercise them. Some call them fundamental rights. Some call them natural rights. However, in law, they have been termed or designated now in 2020 human rights and fundamental freedoms. You have these rights. You can exercise these rights. Remember, a right does not create an obligation. Because you possess a right doesn't necessarily mean that you are using it. But you can use it because fundamentally you have these rights. On the flip side of that, the government owes an obligation towards these rights. The government must respect and ensure these natural rights, these human rights and freedoms. So when you choose to exercise and use them, the government is under obligation to respect and ensure that you are allowed to exercise them. Over the years, we've lost the understanding concerning our individuality in this society, in this system. It's been ingrained in us to surrender ourselves, surrender our individuality, surrender our rights for the betterment of society, for the betterment of the group, for the betterment of the good. Do your part. Pay your taxes. Be a good member of the society. That's what's been pushed. That's the indoctrination of the mind that the government has pushed upon individuals over the past few generations. Within the context of that message, they failed to reveal and failed to teach and failed to bring to light our human rights and fundamental freedoms. They pushed away the individual rights and freedoms and focused our attention upon our group rights and freedoms, or our civil rights and freedoms. Our civil rights and freedoms, these come from the government bodies. These are not natural rights and freedoms that we are born with, but they are rights and freedoms that are created and given to us on paper through words, which is called law. So you're living in a civil society, as they refer to it, and you have rights and duties and responsibilities in this civil society. Now, these rights, duties, and responsibilities, they flow from government-created laws. Laws that men in suit created by sitting around a table, analyzing certain circumstances and situations, and drawing up laws and saying, now these laws apply to the society in general. Again, so you're walking around in a civil society, and you're exercising civil rights, duties, responsibilities, and obligations. And all of this is stemming from laws that are in a book that were created by men who sat around a table and decided that these are the rules, these are the regulations that we are going to put out, and you are going to be forced. You are going to have no choice, but you will have to submit to these rules. This is a system of control and bondage. The mechanism of control and bondage, again, are words on a paper which they call law. Here's how their mechanism, their medium of control works against an individual man or woman. You're in the society as an individual man or woman. You also have your fundamental rights and freedoms, your human rights and freedoms. However, when the government interacts with you, they do not interact with you in your full legal capacity. They do not interact with you recognizing your fundamental rights and freedoms. If you were standing in front of me and I was talking to you, I would recognize you as a man or a woman. And because of the understanding that I would have, I would recognize you as an individual with fundamental rights and freedoms, human rights, natural rights, which you can express and exercise. When the government interacts with you, they do not interact with you under that capacity or under that designation with those rights available for you to use. They are treating you as a statutory creature. A statutory creature is simply a made-up term. It's a designation in law that they created by words on a paper. They tried to create statutory creatures for basically every action that you can take or every action that you would be involved in, and then on that statutory creature, they tried to put rights, duties, and obligations and say you are forced to follow these now. So the working of that system looks like this. I'm a man. If I decide to go fishing, now they no longer recognize me as a man, but as a statutory creature called a fisherman. And that fisherman is under obligation to follow the rules and the laws that they created to govern fishing. If as an individual I decide to go hunting, then under their laws they would say you are operating as a statutory creature called the hunter, and therefore we have this enactment, this regulation, and within it there are rules, duties, and obligations and rights that can be expressed as the hunter, and that's how we see you, only under this enactment. If you're operating as a driver, then the statutory creature is considered the driver, and as the driver, the statutory creature is controlled by the enactments, by the regulations. For example, you must have a license, you must have insurance, you must follow the speed limit of 50 or 100 kilometers an hour. The rights, duties, and obligations of the driver does not come from natural law, does not come from fundamental rights and human freedoms, but it comes from statutory law that the government actors created and said that when you're operating as this driver, then you are subjected, you are obligated, you are forced to follow these rules which we create. If you're in school, then the designated statutory creature that they are treating you as is a student. If you are obtaining medical attention, then you are considered a patient. If you are shopping, or if you are taking credit or a mortgage, then you are considered a consumer. So in every capacity that you function, they designate you a designation, a term, which is actually a statutory creature, which is nothing more than saying it's a subject or it's a player that is controlled by certain rules and regulations, and these rules and regulations are called statutory law. Is all statutory law bad? No. Is the majority of it bad? Yes. I can give you an example. For the Firearms Safety Act, right? Within it, we find some operations of law that say the chief firearm officer, he can restrict individuals from owning a firearm. For example, if you've had a violent past, if you've been a criminal, then he can refuse to allow you to own a firearm. Now, I know the designation of the gun is a firearm, and I know what's going on, but I'm giving you an example of where statutory law is used for the betterment of society, and the restriction that the statutory law is bringing forth is actually a good one. So when you study statutory laws, you can find good restrictions within those laws. However, the majority of those restrictions or those rules, what they are actually doing is they are limiting and abridging your fundamental rights, your human rights and freedoms. So I just mentioned one of the statutory laws that actually operate for the betterment of society and the betterment of man, the betterment of individual families. You wouldn't want someone who has a past of being violent and doing harm to others to be able to have a gun legally and going around and perhaps causing more damage. Now look at the flip side of this. You have statutory laws that say that you have to pay a taxation. You have to give a certain amount of your income to Her Majesty or Her Majesty's agent, the CRA. That's what it says in law. That's actually what you're doing. Every year that you pay taxes, in the law, the CRA is considered an agent of Her Majesty, and your income is being taxed on behalf of Her Majesty. If you feel like having a nice trout, or perhaps a bass, or maybe even a pike, some people like to eat pike, well, according to their statutory law, it is presumed that Her Majesty owns all the fish in the lakes and the rivers. Beautiful word there, presumed, but listen to that operation of law. So it's presumed that she owns all the fish in the rivers and the lakes, and in order for you to have a fish, to enjoy it, you need her permission. How do you need her permission? Well, the system is set up that you will get a license and an authorization if you pay some money to her agents. I'm not a hunter myself. I don't like to kill animals. I care about animals. I have German Shepherd dogs and I take care of them. But if you're a hunter, that's your choice. However, in law, a hunter, it's the same thing. If you feel like going out to catch an animal, a wild animal, to have wild meat, then you must pay for a license, you must pay a fee, and you will be conferred a right upon the hunter that you can now go and get an animal. In the law, it's presumed, that word again, that all the animals in the fields, all the animals in the forest, belong to Her Majesty, the Queen. Now, if you want to harvest one of those animals, again, you have to pay for a right, and the statutory creature, the hunter, will be conferred that right by an agent of Her Majesty. All right, so let's play this out. Here I am. I'm an individual man. I have fundamental rights and freedoms. I'm living on earth, and I'm sharing this earth with everybody else around me, with all other individuals. I cannot come and claim that God has granted me authority over this world, and that I am a ruler of this world. Neither can anyone come to me and claim that fact or that matter also. Her Majesty, the Queen, that kingdom, they have claimed that God has granted them stewardship over the territories that she's ruling. I would always like some proof and some evidence of that claim, of that premise that the crown is building upon. So I'd like to get that fish, go fishing and get that fish from the lake. But the law says, statutory law says, that they presume that all the fish in the rivers and the lakes belong to Her Majesty. I just want to go simply exercise my natural right, my fundamental right to have a fish to eat, to feed myself, to stay alive. However, Her Majesty is now saying that these fish that are residing in the lakes and rivers, they belong to me. And if you want to have one of those fish, you have to pay me some money for a license and an authorization. And if you think you can scoot around these obligations, I have agents in the field carrying guns and carrying weapons and carrying authority in their heads, thinking that they need to enforce my rules and regulations. Well, now there's a problem here, because I'm seeking to exercise a natural fundamental right to feed my belly by taking a fish out of the lake, and you're claiming that that lake belongs to you, and I have to have your permission, and that if I don't seek your permission, your agents, if they catch me, are going to terrorize me, fine me, cost me money. My natural right, my fundamental right to have a fish, is being limited and abridged by your statutory power. Your statutory power is coming to me and saying I'm a fisherman, and in order to have that fish, I have to pay you money and get a license. Now there's a conflict going on. There's a disagreement going on. There's a few levels to this disagreement that is transpiring, but it starts with, again, that they are approaching you as an agent of Her Majesty, and they are considering you a statutory creature under statutory laws. Therefore, you are under obligation to follow their rules and their regulations. Since you are not following their rules and their regulations, now they want to penalize you by fining you and perhaps taking away your equipment. Their position would be, you're operating a civil right. You're operating as a statutory creature, the fisherman, and there are laws, there are rules and regulations that control your behavior. In these rules and regulations, one of them states that you must pay a fee, obtain a license, and an authorization to catch that fish. However, I'm standing here as an individual with fundamental rights, and I'm exercising those fundamental rights to have my fish. Uh-oh. Now here's that problem again. More conflict. You're telling me I'm a statutory creature, controlled by statutory laws, and I need Her Majesty's permission to have that fish. And I'm saying I'm here under my natural rights, eating my fish to feed my belly and live. So those regulations, that statutory power, which is governing the fishermen, is actually limiting and abridging fundamental human rights and freedoms. If they try to enforce that enactment upon an individual, then the individual's defense is that fact, that this operation of law is limiting and abridging my fundamental rights and freedoms. Primarily in the law, the Crown is operating as agents for Her Majesty. Within the Fisheries Act, it's very clear. It states that it is presumed that Her Majesty owns all the fish. The presumption is there. Where's that presumption coming from? Who made that presumption? How in law is that presumption able to stand? Well, it's not. Your Honor, Judge, Sir. Don't call me sir. I am an honor. I am a judge. Yes, Your Honor, of the utter highest level. How is it presumed that Her Majesty owns all the fish? Who gave her all the fish? Who gave her all the fish in Canada? I didn't give her all the fish. My father didn't give her all the fish. Did your father give her all the fish? I want to know what right, what power gave her all the fish here in Canada? The statutory power says that it's presumed that Her Majesty owns all the fish. Who made that presumption, Your Honor? Because this whole case is based upon that presumption, and I think that presumption is kind of odd. I think that presumption is actually whack. So your high and lifted up honor, who spent 10 years as a lawyer and made a whole bunch of connections with other lawyers in the law society, and now has become a judge, and now sits on a bench and rules for other lawyers that they spend time together. Can you please, 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 on public record before the court, have the Crown bring forth and release the information on how it is presumed that we are all to accept that Her Majesty owns the fish in the sea, in the rivers, and in the lakes? 5-minute recess. Recess comes in. You can go. We're dropping the charges. What's going on there? Well, in their statutory law, that article of law that says they presume that Her Majesty owns all the fish, when you challenge that operation of law, it's a direct assault against your fundamental rights and freedoms. When that statutory regulation came into existence, the Attorney General should have never signed off on that regulation or on that statutory power. Why? Because of that simple operation of law. They cannot make the presumption that Her Majesty owns all the fish. Because why? Because then they're saying that you don't have any right to the fish. And that's not equal and fair treatment. Nobody has the right to claim all of the resources of the earth. It doesn't matter if you believe that God created the earth, or if you're an evolutionist, you don't have the right to claim all the resources of the earth or all the resources of the territory, and that's what she's doing. Okay, the fact that they created that law, it should have never been allowed to exist. Why? Because that law limits and abridges my fundamental right and freedom that says, if I want to fish, I'm going to go have my fish and cook it in butter and eat it. And I don't owe Her Majesty any obligation. This is the pharisaical and sadduceical spirit that you see in the Bible, in the Gospels. If you're a believer in the Gospels, then this is exactly what's going on. They're shutting up the kingdom of heaven, the blessings of heaven, through law, through words on a paper. Those fish that are in the river, that are in the lake, they're a blessing to man to eat. And guess what? They are trying to claim that away from man and trying to profit off of the gift that was given by saying, pay us a license, pay us a tribute. will give you authorization, then you may have one. If you're an atheist or an evolutionist, then the same operation of law is applying. They're claiming, hey, listen, buddy, those fish in that river and those fish in those lakes, they belong to Her Majesty the Queen. They're hers. She owns them. If you want one, you got to pay a tribute. Isn't that ridiculous? I'm not going to argue here whether it's right or wrong for the license itself, but I want you to realize that every license that you have ever applied for, the operation of law behind that license was you paid a fee to her agent of Her Majesty, and you were conferred or you were granted a right from Her Majesty to partake in the actions that you were seeking to do. This is 2020, the year 2020. Why are we still living under such bondage and subjection to such an ancient governance that has been going on for a long time and that is guilty of killing many, many people? The answer to that question goes back to the beginning of my video, where I said the government has not taught individuals their fundamental rights and freedoms. They have tried to push and bring forth the obligations and duties and responsibilities as a statutory creature under their laws, but they have utterly failed to teach you of your natural rights and freedoms. Thereby, if you don't know there is something better, if you don't see that there is another way, you will not be going after what is available to you. And in turn, you will remain a good, loyal subject and servant of Her Majesty, the one who, as a Canadian citizen, has pledged their allegiance to Her Majesty and is living under a promise to obey her statutory rules and regulations. And within those regulations, you have to pay her to exercise a privilege.